He walked into the courthouse with the kind of confidence that only money and power could create. His steps were slow, controlled, and heavy with entitlement, as if every tile beneath his shoes existed only to support his weight. Lawyers surrounded him on both sides, dressed in flawless suits, carrying thick folders filled with words, numbers, and strategies that had been designed weeks in advance. His name was Daniel Wright, and in his world problems did not exist for long because money erased. Then people moved aside as he passed, not because they were told to, but because his presence demanded space. He believed this day was already won before it began. Across the courtroom sat Hannah Wright, his wife, or what remained of her role in his life. She wore a simple dress, no jewelry, no designer label, no visible sign of wealth. Her hands were folded calmly in her lap, her posture straight, her face unreadable. She had arrived alone. No lawyer, no assistant, no stack of documents beside her. Just silence. And that silence made people whisper because silence in a place built on arguments felt dangerous. Daniel noticed her immediately, and a slow, satisfied smile appeared on his face. This was exactly how he wanted it to look months earlier. He had planned this moment carefully. He had frozen accounts, delayed access to shared resources, applied pressure through polite legal letters and quiet threats, all designed to weaken her. He wanted her to feel cornered, dependent, desperate. He wanted her to realize that without him she was nothing, and when she did, he expected tears, apologies, and surrender. But none of that had happened. Instead, she had withdrawn, quietly disappearing into herself and waiting. And that waiting unsettled him, though. He refused to acknowledge it. Daniel leaned toward one of his lawyers and whispered something. The lawyer smiled, suppressing a laugh. The message was simple. She could not even afford a lawyer. The words were not spoken aloud, but they hung in the air, sharp and cruel. Hannah did not react. She did not look at him. She did not shift in her seat. Her calm only fed his arrogance. He mistook her silence for defeat, the way he always had. The courtroom slowly filled, journalists, legal interns, curious observers, all drawn by the name Daniel Wright. The respected investor, the generous donor, the man who spoke about integrity and family on conference stages. No one spoke about Hannah because no one thought she mattered. She was just the wife who failed, just the woman who had been left behind. People judged quietly, the way they always do, assuming weakness when they see solitude. Daniel sat comfortably, his legal team occupying an entire row behind him. Tablets open, pens ready, documents prepared. To control every outcome, he glanced at Hannah again, expecting fear or doubt. But her eyes remained forward, her breathing steady. She looked like someone waiting for something, not someone who had lost. The judge had not yet entered, but the tension was already thick. Daniel checked his watch impatiently. He wanted this finished. He wanted the signature, the ruling, the final proof that he had won, not just the case, but the narrative. He wanted the world to see that he was untouchable, that even his failures ended on his terms. Hannah listened to the whispers around her. She heard her name spoken softly with pity. She heard his spoken with admiration, but she did not respond. She remembered the nights she had sat quietly across from Daniel, at a long dining table, listening to him talk about power and vision while ignoring her words. She remembered the way he dismissed her opinions, laughed at her concerns, and slowly erased her presence from his life. She remembered when silence became her shield. What no one in that room understood was that Hannah had not come unprepared. She had not come hopeless. She had come exactly when she intended to, because timing mattered more than noise. She was not alone, even if it looked that way. And the people who underestimated her were about to learn the cost of that mistake. As the courtroom doors remained closed and the judge prepared to enter, Daniel adjusted his tie, confident, relaxed, already imagining the moment he would walk out free and victorious, unaware that the story he believed was ending. It's only just beginning. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone rose, then sat again as the atmosphere tightened. Daniel remained confident. His lawyers exchanged subtle nods already, prepared to dominate the conversation, while Hannah stayed still, her gaze calm, her expression unreadable. The judge reviewed the case briefly, mentioning dates, assets, and prior filings. all of which favored Daniel on paper because paper was where. He always won. The judge finally looked toward Hannah and asked if she had legal representation. A faint murmur moved through the room. Daniel smirked, expecting silence, confirmation of everything he believed about her weakness. But Hannah slowly lifted her head and said nothing, not because she had no answer, but because she was waiting for the right moment. The judge cleared his throat and was about to proceed when a sound echoed through the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors opening. Footsteps followed, steady, deliberate heels striking the floor one after another, drawing every eye in the room toward the entrance. Conversations stopped, breaths held, and Daniel turned, annoyed at the interruption, until he saw her. A woman entered, wearing a tailored suit, her posture commanding, her presence undeniable. She walked with the confidence of someone who did not ask permission to exist. The room recognized her before Daniel did. Whispers spread instantly. Judges, assistants, lawyers, even his own legal team stiffened because they knew who she was. Margaret Hale, the woman who had written the laws. They argued over the attorney who had trained half the people in the building, the strategist who had ended careers with a single case. She walked straight toward Hannah without hesitation and stood beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. And in that moment, understanding hit Daniel like a blow to the chest. The color drained from his face. His lawyers stopped smiling, stopped whispering, stopped breathing comfortably. Margaret finally spoke, requesting to be entered as counsel for the respondent, her voice steady, controlled, and impossible to ignore. The judge nodded immediately, granting the request without question. Daniel felt the power shift around him, like the ground moving beneath his feet. The room that had once leaned toward him now leaned away. Hannah remained silent, but something had changed. Her stillness was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was authority waiting its turn, and as Daniel realized who truly stood behind the woman he had tried to destroy, his confidence cracked for the first time in his life. Daniel tried to recover his posture, but the damage was already done. His hands tightened on the armrest as his lawyers leaned toward each other, whispering urgently, their confidence evaporating because they knew Margaret Hale was not just another opponent. She was a force, the kind that rewrote outcomes and destroyed carefully built illusions. The judge now addressed the courtroom with a different tone, one of respect and caution, asking Margaret to proceed, and she did not rush. She never rushed. She began calmly outlining the history of the marriage, but not the version Daniel had paid to circulate. She spoke of control, financial manipulation, emotional isolation, and deliberate efforts to strip Hannah of independence. Each sentence landed like weight because it was spoken with evidence, not emotion. Documents were submitted, transactions, timelines, patterns of behavior that painted a very different picture of the generous husband. Daniel shifted in his seat, trying to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. Something Daniel was not used to experiencing. Hannah sat quietly beside her mother, listening, not with fear, but with resolve, because every word spoken now reflected the truth she had lived in silence. Margaret continued, revealing hidden accounts, strategic asset transfers, and legal maneuvers designed to leave Hannah defenseless. Daniel's lawyers attempted objections, but their voices lacked conviction. They were reacting, not leading, and everyone could see it. The courtroom that once buzzed with admiration now watched Daniel with suspicion. Journalists leaned forward, pens ready, sensing the narrative changing in real time. Daniel glanced at Hannah, searching for some trace of the woman he once believed he controlled. But she did not look at him. She no longer needed to. As the judge reviewed the submissions, his expression hardened, asking pointed questions. Daniel struggled to answer each one, exposing gaps, contradictions, and intentions he had assumed would never be challenged. For the first time, Daniel understood what it meant to be underestimated, because he had done it to her, and now it was being done to him by the very system he thought he owned. And as the session was adjourned temporarily, the judge scheduled further review, signaling that nothing would be decided today. Daniel realized with growing dread that this was no longer a simple divorce. It was the beginning of a reckoning he could not buy his way out of. The days that followed blurred into a relentless sequence of hearings, filings, and closed-door conferences, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Wright felt time working against him rather than for him. Every morning he entered the courthouse, with less confidence than the day before, watching familiar faces avoid his gaze. Journalists who once praised him now questioned him. Analysts dissected his statements online, and investors began to quietly distance themselves while inside the courtroom. Margaret Hale moved with calculated precision, never raising her voice, never dramatizing the facts, simply laying them bare, piece by piece, until the image Daniel had spent years constructing began to fracture. Hannah remained beside her mother throughout it all, calm, observant, learning not just the law but her own strength as she listened to her life translated into evidence. Every ignored conversation, every restricted account, every subtle threat transformed into legal language that carried weight. Daniel attempted damage control, issuing public statements, donating to charities, speaking about privacy and respect, but nothing stuck because the silence he had once weaponized was now turned against him. Margaret exposed how he had isolated Hannah. From friends, redirected shared funds into shell accounts, and leveraged non-disclosure agreements to keep former employees. Quiet witnesses began to appear, people Daniel assumed were loyal accountants, assistants, former partners, each one confirming patterns of control that painted a chilling picture. The judge grew increasingly stern, setting tighter deadlines, demanding transparency, ordering forensic audits that uncovered more than Daniel ever anticipated: assets hidden, overseas properties registered under proxies, trusts designed to appear charitable while shielding wealth from division. Daniel's legal team fractured under pressure. One attorney withdrew, citing conflict, another advised settlement, but Daniel refused, still clinging to the belief that power would save him. Hannah watched this unraveling, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. She realized she had never been weak. She had simply been patient, waiting for truth to find its voice outside the courtroom. Her story inspired others. Messages arrived quietly from women who had seen themselves in her silence, who now saw another path. Margaret guided Hannah, not just as a lawyer, but as a mother, reminding her that justice was not revenge, but restoration. The hearings intensified, culminating in a day when Daniel was ordered to testify under oath. The man who once controlled every narrative now stumbled over his words, confronted with his own emails, his own signatures, his own contradictions. The courtroom felt different, heavier, charged with consequence as the judge listened without interruption. When Daniel finished, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. Margaret stood and spoke briefly, summarizing months of evidence into a simple truth: Hannah had been systematically diminished to make Daniel feel larger, and the law could not ignore that any longer. When the judge adjourned the court for deliberation, the room exhaled. Daniel sat alone, surrounded by people, yet isolated. Hannah stood with her mother, feeling the ground steady beneath her feet for the first time in years, understanding that whatever the ruling, she had already reclaimed something far more valuable than money or reputation. She had reclaimed herself. And as they walked out together, cameras flashing, questions shouted, Hannah did not speak. She did not need to. Her silence no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to power, earned and recognized, and the world was finally paying attention. The final day arrived, not with noise, but with weight, the kind that pressed on every person inside the courtroom. Because everyone understood that whatever happened next would echo far beyond these walls. Daniel Wright entered without the confidence that once defined him. His steps slower, his shoulders tense, his face marked by sleepless nights and quiet fear. His legal team was smaller now, their strategies exhausted, their options limited. While across the aisle, Hannah stood beside her mother, grounded, steady, transformed not by clothes or posture, but by certainty. The judge took the bench, and the room fell into a silence so deep it felt intentional. The ruling began, slowly, methodically, summarizing months of testimony, audits, witness statements, and undeniable patterns of behavior. The judge spoke of responsibility, of abuse that did not leave bruises, but scars of manipulation, control, and calculated deprivation, each word dismantled the image Daniel had carefully curated for years. The court recognized Hannah not as a dependent spouse, but as a victim of systematic erosion of autonomy and dignity, and with that recognition came consequence the ruling awarded Hannah not just a fair division of assets, but damages for emotional harm, restitution for concealed funds, and legal sanctions that stripped Daniel of privileges he once assumed untouchable. The judge ordered disclosures, investigations, and referrals that extended beyond this marriage into Daniel's professional dealings. The room absorbed the verdict in stunned stillness. Journalists wrote furiously, lawyers exchanged glances. Daniel remained frozen, unable to process the collapse of a future he believed was guaranteed. When the gavel finally fell, it did not sound like victory or defeat. It sounded like finality. Hannah closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in release. Years of silence lifted in that moment, not replaced by anger, but by clarity. She thanked the judge quietly, then turned to her mother, whose presence had never wavered. Margaret Hale nodded. Once proud, not because her daughter had one, but because she had stood. The cameras followed. Hannah, as she exited, questions shouted about revenge, justice, money, legacy, but she did not answer because her story no longer needed explanation outside. The courthouse sunlight touched her face differently than before, as if the world itself acknowledged her return to herself. Daniel watched from a distance, surrounded by consequences, stripped of illusion, realizing too late that power without integrity collapses under its own weight. The people who once admired him now avoided him. The system he believed he owned had reminded him of its true purpose, and Hannah walked away not as a woman saved by someone else, but as a woman who had remembered who stood behind her and who she had always been. And in that quiet departure, a lesson remained clear: underestimate silence at your own risk. Because quiet strength does not announce itself. It arrives exactly when it is needed, and when it does, nothing can stop it.